The wands were beginning to blend together. That was Harry's honest assessment of the situation, delivered to nobody, while a 9th wand, or possibly the 10th, he had genuinely lost count, produced a sound like a gunshot in the narrow shop and sent a tower of boxes crashing from the highest shelf into the dusty dark below. Ollivander said mildly that perhaps not that one. He retrieved the fallen boxes with unhurried precision, stacking them with the ease of a man who had rebuilt this particular tower many times before. Harry's hand was trembling. He put it in his pocket so Hagrid couldn't see the shop, felt as though the rest of Diagon Alley had simply forgotten it was there. While the street outside was warm and loud and crammed with a particular chaos of late July, families in robes, children peering into windows, the distant smell of something brined and strange. Ollivander's was cool and dim and smelled of sawdust and something else Harry couldn't name. The boxes rose in columns to the ceiling. The single spindly chair stood in the center of the room like a prop, waiting for a play to begin. Ollivander himself moved through the narrow space with the deliberateness of a man who had always lived here, who had no intention of ever leaving, and who found human discomfort genuinely interesting rather than worth alleviating. Maple and phoenix feather, 7 inches, Ollivander said, returning a box to the shelf and selecting another without pause. Slightly springy, if you please. Harry tried it. A large, ornate measuring tape that had been coiled on the counter flung itself at the window. Hagrid, seated in the corner, with his knees folded up nearly to his ears and his pink umbrella balanced across his lap, made a quiet sound and looked at the ceiling. The wand after that was Hornbeam, which produced a deeply unhappy purple smoke. The one after was Hawthorn, which did nothing at all, which Ollivander said was rather worse than the smoke. Ebony next. This one vibrated in Harry's hand like a second heartbeat, urgent and unfamiliar, and Ollivander watched it for a moment and said quietly, "Not quite, not quite." Then the old man came to the counter, carrying a long, narrow box with the particular deliberateness of someone who had been saving it. Holly and phoenix feather, 11 inches, nice and supple. He set the box down, lifted the wand from its velvet bed with his long white fingers, and held it out. Harry took it. The difference was immediate and complete. Something moved up his arm that had nothing to do with electricity or warmth, that was more like the first breath after holding your breath too long. Not dramatic, not dazzling, but simply right, the way nothing else in the last hour had been right. He raised the wand without quite meaning to, and golden sparks cascaded from the tip in a long, fizzing arc that lit the narrow shop gold and amber, and briefly, extraordinarily beautiful. "Oh, bravo!" Ollivander clasped his hands. His eyes, pale and enormous, shining like 2 moons in the gloom, were fixed on the wand in Harry's hand with an expression that Harry might have called joy, if joy could also be unsettling. Yes, indeed, how curious. He was still watching. How very curious. The sparks faded. The shop went quiet. "What's curious?" Harry asked. Ollivander raised one long finger. It was the gesture of a man who had been waiting all afternoon for exactly this question. "I remember every wand I've ever sold, Mr. Potter. Every single wand." He moved to the end of the counter, hands clasped behind him, and regarded Harry across the dark. "It so happens that the phoenix whose tail feather is in your wand gave another feather, just one other." A pause. His pale eyes did not blink. "It is very curious indeed that you should be destined for this wand when its brother, why? Its brother gave you that scar." The shop was very quiet now. Harry was aware of Hagrid behind him, going still, the way large things go still when they are suddenly frightened. He was aware of the open door, a few inches ajar, as it had been all afternoon, and the sounds from Diagon Alley drifting through it, laughter and footsteps, and the distant call of someone selling something. He was aware of the wand in his hand. Still warm, 13.5 inches, Ollivander was saying. You, the other wand. He was describing the other wand. Harry's scar did not hurt. It simply sat above his left eye the way it always had, a small, permanent seam, and he had lived with it for 11 years without understanding what it meant, and he had learned today, less than 10 hours ago, in a draughty hut on a rock in the sea, that it was the mark of a man who had tried to stop him. A man who had also killed his mother and his father. A man who had left behind nothing except ruined houses and broken families, and one small boy in a cupboard under the stairs, who had grown up without knowing that the word for what had happened to his family was violence. The wand chooses the wizard, Ollivander had said at the beginning when the process started. Harry had not known what that meant. He set the wand down on the spindly chair. I don't want it. The words came out louder than he had intended. They came out very loud, actually, with the particular carrying quality of a voice that had spent 11 years being suppressed, and was not entirely certain how to modulate itself when it was finally permitted to say something true. He understood, distantly, that the door was open, and the street outside had gone quiet in just that moment, that the combination of factors had sent his voice straight into Diagon Alley like something thrown. He did not think about any of that. He only knew what he was saying, and that he meant it. I don't want a wand that matches his. He stepped back from the chair. I don't care if it chose me. I'm not taking it. Behind him, Hagrid made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound of a very large man trying to find the right thing to say, and discovering that none of the options were quite right, that perhaps there was no right thing, and settling instead for gripping the handle of his pink umbrella until it produced a faint creak of protest. Ollivander looked at Harry for a long, unhurried moment. His pale eyes moved from Harry's face to the wand on the chair, to Harry's face again, as though completing some private calculation. His expression was not angry. It was not even particularly surprised. It was the expression of a man who finds the world interesting and has just found it more interesting than usual. The wand chooses the wizard, remember, he said quietly. I think we must expect great things from you, Mr. Potter. He did not complete the rest of the sentence, the part about great things and terrible things, who must not be named. Perhaps it was a mercy. Perhaps he had simply decided. Harry already knew. He reached out with his long fingers, lifted the holly wand from the chair with great care, and turned back toward the shelves. The wand will wait, he said, from somewhere among the columns of boxes, his voice carried through the dark with perfect calm. It has waited 11 years. It is patient. There was the sound of a box being set into its place somewhere high, then the sound of a different box being lifted down. Now let us try again. Harry stood in the center of the shop and breathed. From behind him, through the door that was still standing slightly open to the summer afternoon, the noise of Diagon Alley drifted in. It had the same volume, approximately, the same general density of footsteps and voices. But the quality of it had shifted in a way Harry could not quite name, as though the individual sounds had reorganized themselves into a different pattern, the pattern of many people turning toward the same thing at once, of a few words passing from one mouth to the next and the next. He would not understand for some time what he had done, or what it meant, or why every adult in the vicinity would go peculiarly still when they heard. He only understood, standing there with empty hands and Ollivander, somewhere behind him, already looking for what came next, that something had moved through the crowd outside. His name, he thought, his name, and what he'd said. Ollivander did not argue. He worked. That was the first thing Harry understood about him. In the minutes that followed, he was not going to try to change Harry's mind. He was not going to deliver a lecture about destiny or wand law or the wisdom of accepting what had been chosen for you. He simply went back to the shelves, retrieved boxes with the same meticulous care with which he had been retrieving them all afternoon, and resumed the process as though the interruption had been entirely ordinary, which Harry supposed perhaps it had. He had no way of knowing what Ollivander considered ordinary. The phoenix feather wands came first. There were 3 of them in quick succession, a long, dark-wooded one that flung itself from Harry's hand almost before he had closed his fingers around it, skidding across the floor and coming to rest under the lowest shelf as though hiding. A second that produced sparks, briefly blue-white and cold rather than gold, and then went dead in his palm with a finality that felt almost personal, and a third that simply refused to be held in any meaningful sense, lying in Harry's hand with the inertness of something that had already made its decision and did not see any point in discussing it. "Peculiar," Ollivander said, picking up the 3rd wand and examining it with his long fingers. "Very peculiar indeed. I wonder if they can sense it. The refused brother wand. Whether the intention communicates itself to others of the same core." He was quiet for a moment, studying the wand. Then he set it aside and went back to the shelves. Not unhappy, thinking. Harry said nothing. He had the strong impression that Ollivander was as interested in the problem as he was in the solution, and that the two were not for him especially different things. The dragon heartstring wands were another matter. The first produced a flare of hot orange light, immediate, almost violent, and Harry could feel the thing burning in his hand, not painfully but insistently, like a coal wrapped several times in cloth. He attempted the levitation Ollivander indicated, and a row of boxes rose from the shelf, and then kept rising, past the point where they should have stopped, until 2 of them went through the ceiling boards and there was a muffled crash from somewhere above. Ollivander vanished the remaining boxes before they could follow, and said nothing about the ceiling. The second dragon heartstring started a small fire in the lower corner of the nearest shelving unit. Ollivander extinguished it, with a gesture so practiced and unhurried, it was clear this was not the first fire this room had known, and possibly not the first this week. He looked at the wand for a moment, then at Harry, and said it was a wand that needed a confident hand and would thrive with one. Harry's hand was confident enough, but the wand itself was not persuaded they were a match. He returned it. The third was closer. A strong, immediate response, magic running through it with a kind of blunt efficiency. But when Harry finished the test gesture, his wrist ached and his palm was faintly red, as though he had pressed it against something warm for too long. Ollivander took it back without comment. What came next was quieter. Not dramatically so, but in the way that the space between 2 loud things is quiet, a noticeably different quality of air. Ollivander produced a paler box than the others, unlacquered, and opened it without ceremony. Vinewood and unicorn hair, 10 3/4 inches, slightly yielding. The wand was pale, the color of old birch, with a grain that moved through it like a slow current. Harry picked it up. There were no sparks, no gold light, no boxes ascending through the ceiling, no corners deciding to catch fire. The feeling that moved through his hand was steadier than any of that, the particular reassurance of something that was not dazzling, but was solid, the way a good chair is solid, the kind of solid you only appreciate when you've been standing on uncertain ground for a long time. He turned his wrist, following an instinct he couldn't have named, and a soft, warm light bloomed from the tip and simply held itself there, as steady as a candle in still air. Ollivander was quiet. Harry let the light fade. He turned the wand over in his hand. It still felt solid. It still felt entirely, unspectacularly, there. "Well," said Ollivander. He came around the counter, moving slowly, and studied Harry's hand holding the wand. Then Harry's face, reading something with those pale, moon-colored eyes that Harry himself had not read yet. "Not perfect," Ollivander said finally, "but willing." He produced a length of dark paper and a ribbon from under the counter, and wrapped the wand with the same deliberate care with which he did everything. 7 galleons, he said. Harry counted them out. Hagrid, who had not spoken since the exchange about the holy wand, which was already a considerable achievement for a man constitutionally incapable of extended quiet, cleared his throat and did not speak. Ollivander set the coins aside. He lifted the holly and phoenix feather wand from its velvet bed, looked at it for a moment in the way someone looks at something they have made and are reluctant to put away, and then slid it into its box and pressed the lid closed. He returned it to its shelf with the precision of a librarian returning a book to exactly its proper place. "If you change your mind," he said without turning around, "the wand will be here. I don't sell what is already chosen." He settled the box into its gap in the column. "It will wait. It is patient." He said it without opinion, without encouragement or discouragement, as a simple statement of fact about the nature of wands. The crowd outside had arranged itself in the elaborate pattern of people who were definitely not staring. A witch near the apothecary became very interested in a display of dried bat wings. A wizard in a green hat found his shoelace urgently requiring attention. 2 children looked at Harry with the unabashed directness that only children and very old people permit themselves, until their mother caught them each by the shoulder. Harry kept his eyes forward. Hagrid's enormous hand came down gently on his shoulder and steered him along the alley toward the leaky cauldron. "Rye," said Hagrid. It was not a complete sentence, but it was a kind one. The leaky cauldron was nearly empty when they came through. The morning crowd, the people who had greeted Harry with such startled recognition, had long since gone, replaced by a handful of strangers hunched over their drinks, and Tom the barman polishing something behind the counter. A fire burned in the grate. The room had the specific quiet of a place that had seen a long day, and was glad to be nearly done with it. Hagrid sat across from Harry, wrapped both enormous hands around a butterbeer that looked comically small and said, "Are you sure, Harry?" Harry thought about the holly wand on its shell. He thought about the gold sparks and the feeling of something finely fitting, and about what Ollivander had said immediately after, about twin feathers and 13.5 inches and the wand that had given him his scar. "Yes," Harry said. Hagrid looked at him for a long moment, then at the butterbeer. He took a drink and did not argue, which Harry thought was possibly the kindest thing anyone had ever done for him. They sat. Harry held his own butterbeer, warm, tasting of honey and something faintly like fireworks, and thought about nothing in particular until Hagrid said in a careful voice that the Hogwarts Express left from King's Cross on the 1st of September, platform 9 3/4, and it was a bit tricky to find, but his letter would explain. Harry said he would figure it out. They finished their drinks and left. The train back to Little Whinging was nothing like the world Harry had spent the day in, which felt already distant in the way of things too large to have quite happened yet. He sat with his school trunk and his owl and unwrapped the vinewood wand after a while, not particularly meaning to, and held it in the long light of the window. Pale grain, unicorn hair, Ollivander had said, the most consistent core, the least given to fluctuation, the steadiness was still there, not electric, not burning, not spectacular. Simply present in the way that useful things are present, without fanfare, without apology. He did not know yet whether that was enough. He told himself it was, and watched England go past, and tried to decide if those two things were the same. Draco had been close enough to hear the name. The words themselves had come through blurred. There was the problem of the shop door, a wall of adult backs, and the general acoustic difficulty of being 11 and not yet tall enough to see over most things. But the name Potter had carried clearly, because when it passed through a crowd, it moved differently. It made people go still, and then suddenly animate the way a current passes through still water. He had worked his way close enough to piece it together. The Potter boy on his birthday had refused the wand that matched you-know-whose, said he wouldn't take it. Said it in a voice that apparently carried straight into the street. By the time Draco got near enough to see, the deed was already done, and the shop door was standing open on a room full of quiet people. And Draco had no way of knowing what had happened next, but knew enough to carry it home. His father was waiting at the far end of the alley. Lucius Malfoy stood with his hands clasped behind his back, and his silver-topped cane resting against his forearm, his pale hair catching the afternoon light, his eyes moving across the crowd with the unhurried attention of a man cataloguing information. He looked at Draco when Draco arrived. He did not ask any questions in the street. Draco said nothing yet either. He understood at 11 that there was a right moment for this kind of news. The right moment turned out to be after dinner. His mother sat opposite him at the long table, her own pale hair smooth against her shoulders, her hands folded in her lap. Her face wore the particular expression she reserved for watching his father, rather than the room, attentive and still, measuring something invisible. Lucius sat at the head of the table with no expression at all, which was how Draco had learned to tell when his father was paying close attention. "And then he just set it down," Draco said. "On the chair, stepped back from it. Said he didn't want a wand that matched you. No, who said it quite loudly. Actually, the whole alley heard. Lucius said nothing for a moment. He named him. His voice was even. He said, 'Criminals.'" Draco paused. He was very clear about it. Silence extended itself around the table. Narcissa did not look at Draco. She looked at Lucius. Lucius rose and walked once to the window, his cane tapping against the stone, and stood with his back to the room. He stayed that way long enough that Draco was beginning to think the conversation had somehow ended without anyone noticing. Then he turned. "Foolishness," Lucius said in the tone of a man thinking aloud. Or something more dangerous than foolishness. He regarded some point on the far wall. Either way, interesting. He did not say anything further. Draco looked at his mother. Her face gave him nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The room where Quirrell was staying above the leaky cauldron was small and smelled of damp, and something faintly sulphurous that he had given up trying to identify. He sat on the edge of the bed and assembled what he had gathered through the evening fragments. From the bar, a brief exchange between two wizards near the fire, Tom, the barman, repeating something to a customer, in the particular tone of a man who considered himself a reliable source. The Potter boy, at Ollivander's, had refused. The other voice did not wait for him to finish thinking. He refused it. The thought arrived, as the other voice's thoughts always arrived, not quite as sound and not quite as pressure, but as something between them, a cold assertion with the weight of certainty behind it. Quirrell sat still and felt the implications moving. The twin-core wand, holly and phoenix feather. If the boy had taken it, there would have been a complication in time in any direct duel. The priori incantatem effect, wands from the same source refusing to properly fight each other, golden threads and the dead returning. Quirrell had known about this possibility, had wondered whether it would matter. Now it would not matter at all. The boy had solved the problem himself by refusing. Another movement in the cold place at the back of his skull. But also, the other voice was always thorough. But also, without the twin-core wand, the boy cannot produce that effect against us either. He refused a protection. He is more vulnerable now, not less. What moved through Quirrell's borrowed thoughts was not quite satisfaction. It was more like the particular sensation of a calculation arriving at its answer. Harry Potter was 11 years old, carrying a secondary wand, and he would grow. That was the important fact. He would grow, which meant the stone had to come first, before the boy grew. Before the gap in his wandwork closed, Quirrell pressed his hands against his knees. He thought, I should sleep. The other voice did not respond to this, because it did not sleep and had developed over the past months a fine contempt for the suggestion. The owl from Hagrid arrived at Hogwarts while the last of the summer light was leaving the sky. Dumbledore read it once, set it down, read it again. The handwriting was unmistakably Hagrid's, a cramped, enthusiastic script that sloped badly to the left and was full of crossed-out attempts at words Hagrid had apparently decided were too complicated and replaced with simpler ones. The message itself was brief. He read it a third time, which was less about the content than about giving himself time to think. He set the letter down and looked at Fawkes. The phoenix was on his perch near the window, working through the careful business of preening a flight feather with the focused deliberateness of a bird that took its appearance seriously. He did not look up. His plumage held the last daylight in a way that suggested he was producing his own warmth, which was, in a sense, accurate. Dumbledore did not ask what the bird thought. He had known Fawkes for a very long time, and had learned that phoenixes communicated on their own schedule and regarded direct questions with something very close to disdain. He had allowed Fawkes to give those two feathers all those years ago. He had not instructed it. Fawkes made no decisions on instruction, but he had allowed it. He had known about the pairing and had said nothing to Ollivander and nothing to anyone. That distinction between allowing and intending had felt clear to him for decades. This evening it felt somewhat less so. The letter said, Harry refused the holly wand. Found another unicorn hair. Vine wood. Seems sure. Didn't argue. Sorry, Hagrid. Dumbledore sat for a while. He was not certain whether he was troubled by what the boy had chosen to do, or by what the choice revealed about who the boy was. Less than one day, a wizard, knowing nothing of wand lore, nothing of the political implications, nothing of priori incantatem or twin cores or the careful network of Dumbledore's long-term preparations. And still he had looked at what destiny offered him and said, not that, not from strategy, from conviction. Dumbledore found conviction in 11-year-olds simultaneously more reassuring and more alarming than almost anything else in the world. He summoned McGonagall. She arrived promptly, in full composure, her black robes settled and her expression managing to convey both patience and the precise edge of it. She read the letter he offered, her square spectacles catching the lamplight. She handed it back. He understood the significance, she said. About the twin cores Ollivander would have explained, and you think this is not cause for concern. I think, Dumbledore said carefully, that it is not straightforwardly bad news. I would like you to watch him when term begins, not for danger, for something else, something I don't yet have a useful word for. McGonagall regarded him with the expression she had developed specifically for his more opaque requests, something between skepticism and the weary trust of long professional partnership. She had written Harry Potter's name in the Book of Magical Children 11 years ago, had watched a terrible night become something more complicated, had spent a decade knowing the boy would come to Hogwarts and wondering what would arrive when he did. She was accustomed to things being complicated. She did not have to find it comfortable. "Very well," she said, and left, which meant she understood him and did not need to say so. Dumbledore sat alone. Fawkes settled his preened feather with a small, satisfied ruffle and closed his eyes. Outside, the last of July was becoming the 1st of August, and somewhere in a house in Surrey, a boy who had been a wizard for less than one day was holding a vinewood wand and probably trying to decide whether he had done the right thing. Dumbledore steepled his fingers and thought that he himself was not yet certain. He suspected Harry would find out before he did. The barrier between platforms 9 and 10 looked exactly like a barrier between platforms 9 and 10, which was the problem. Harry had arrived at King's Cross with his trunk and his owl, and the information that he needed platform 9 3/4, which was a number that did not correspond to anything he could see. He stood on the concourse for long enough to start worrying, which he recognized as unhelpful, and then he did the thing he had learned to do when he didn't know what to do next. He watched what other people were doing and waited for a pattern. The family solved it. A cluster of red-haired people moved through the crowd with an overloaded trolley and an atmosphere of loud, comfortable family chaos. And one of the older boys said something that made 2 others laugh in the way that required a certain amount of space, and Harry fell into step about 20 yards behind them without quite deciding to. He watched a boy with a prefect badge on his chest push his trolley directly at the solid barrier between platforms 9 and 10, and disappear as though the wall had accepted him as a reasonable interpretation of a door. Harry pushed his own trolley through without stopping, because stopping would have made it worse. He came out onto a platform filled with steam and noise, and the particular organized chaos of hundreds of people, all attempting to say goodbye at the same moment. The red-haired family was already separating into its parts. A round, kind-faced woman pulling the youngest-looking boy into a hug he was enduring with visible patience, a thin, enthusiastic man craning his neck to look at the scarlet train engine. Several of the older boys were loading trunks. One of them, roughly Harry's age, had the same red hair and freckles and robes that were slightly too short in the sleeve. Harry thought, "I am going to get on this train." He thought it very firmly. The red-haired boy found Harry in a nearly empty compartment 10 minutes after the train left the station. His name was Ron. He had a rat on his lap and the practical manner of someone who had always shared space with a lot of people and found it natural. He assessed the compartment, sat down, and they rode in comfortable silence until the outskirts of London gave way to open fields, at which point Ron said, with the air of a decision made, "You're Harry Potter from Ollivander's." Harry considered this. "Just from Ollivander's?" "Well, you're also Harry Potter." Ron produced a wrapped pasty from somewhere in his robes and offered half. "My dad heard at work. He's at the ministry." He had a particular kind of look when he told my mum about it, which usually means something important happened. "Was it true? All of it?" "Yes," Harry said. "The part where you said it to the whole alley." "Yes," Ron nodded, chewing. "Brave or just strange," Harry considered. "I'm not sure those are different things." Ron seemed to find this an adequate answer. He settled back and looked out the window, and they rode in comfortable quiet until the girl appeared in the compartment doorway looking for a toad. She had very bushy brown hair and the focused energy of someone running a project. She looked at Harry, confirmed there was no toad, and then looked at Harry again with an expression of different attention. "You're the one who refused the wand," she said. "Yes," Harry said. She came in and sat down. "I've read about it," she said without preface. "The twin core principle. Two wands from the same core source cannot properly duel. When they meet in conflict, they connect, and the wand that last yielded forces the other to replay its recent spells in reverse. It's called priori incantatum. It's documented in Hogwarts, a history, and in Ollivander's treatise on wand compatibility." She stopped. "So, you knew before you refused?" "No," Harry said. "I just didn't want a wand that matched his." She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone revising a theory. Then, "That's exactly what I've been saying," Ron told her. She introduced herself as Hermione Granger, said she hoped they'd do well at the sorting, and left to continue looking for the toad, which turned out to belong to a round-faced boy called Neville, who she had apparently taken on as a project. The Great Hall that evening was everything a year of curious silence at Privet Drive had not prepared Harry for. The ceiling held floating candles and a sky that was impossible. The tables were full of hundreds of students who knew where they sat and why. At the center of the raised platform, Dumbledore sat with his long silver beard and half-moon spectacles, and the expression of a man who began every year exactly as interested as he was the year before. The Sorting Hat sang about houses and the qualities each one kept. Draco Malfoy went to Slytherin before Harry reached the stool, the hat barely touching his hair. He walked to the table with the ease of someone going somewhere they had always known they would go, and as he sat, he looked across the hall at Harry. Not a challenge, something more patient than that. The look of someone who was taking note. Neville Longbottom went a little before Harry too, nearly fell over the stool on the way to it, caught himself, and sat very still while the hat spent an unusually long time deciding. When it called Gryffindor, Neville walked to the table with a relief so visible it was almost like watching a held breath finally released, and he sat carefully and looked at nothing in particular for a moment, the way people do when they've just been told something they hoped was true. When the hat settled over Harry's eyes, a small, dry voice spoke into the dark about qualities and choices. He was aware, distantly, of what it was looking at. Then it said Gryffindor, and he crossed to the table and sat beside Neville, who looked at him with the uncomplicated gratitude of someone glad to be less alone than they were a moment ago. Dumbledore's start-of-term speech covered rules, and a corridor on the 3rd floor currently off-limits, for reasons that would become clear to anyone who sustained an injury. He spoke with the warm authority of a man who had given this speech many times and had never stopped meaning it. Somewhere in the middle of it, his blue eyes moved across the first-year row and paused on Harry for just a moment. Not an assessment, exactly. Something more considered than that. Harry looked back. Dumbledore moved on. Gryffindor Tower that evening was warm and crowded, and too interested in Harry's wand. He gathered this from the corner of the common room where an older girl with red hair was telling another student something Harry caught in pieces. A rare wood, decades waiting, something Dumbledore had apparently arranged personally. He heard his name repeated in varying emphases. He turned the vinewood wand over in his pocket and thought about Ollivander's plain assessment and the distance between that truth and what was currently traveling through the older years. "They're saying your wand's the rarest in the school," Ron reported from the chair across from him, with the even-handed interest of someone who neither needed it to be true nor wanted to be the one to deny it. "It's not," Harry said. "Still, good story," said Ron, and picked up a chess piece. In the dormitory later, Harry sat on the edge of his bed with the vinewood wand in his hand and pointed it at the window. A small, steady light bloomed from the tip and held. He had been doing this since August. Small spells, careful ones, and the wand had been reliable in the way that a thing is reliable when it was built, for exactly this to be used, to respond, to not fail. It simply did not feel the way the holy wand had felt, for those few seconds in Ollivander's, as though something had finally recognized him. He told himself this was what wands were supposed to do. He was almost right. The matches were half the problem. That was what Harry decided, watching the first transfiguration attempt dissolve into a match that was still a match, only slightly more embarrassed about it. The theory was straightforward enough. McGonagall had explained it with the brisk patience of someone who had explained it many times and considered it self-evident. But between the theory and the needle, something was getting lost, and Harry was beginning to think the thing that was getting lost was in the wand. His second attempt produced a needle, silver-grey, correctly tapered, sitting on the desk, with the definite look of something that had decided to be a needle and committed to it. He was aware, in the way that you are aware of things you would rather not be aware of, that the student beside him had produced a needle on the first try. McGonagall moved through the rows in the silence of someone compiling information. When she reached Harry's desk, she looked at the needle, then at the unsuccessful match from the first attempt, then at Harry. She wrote something in her register in small, precise script. She did not say anything. It was in the corridor afterward that she fell into step beside him. She did not slow down. She did not turn her head. "The wand is not everything, Mr. Potter," she said. She continued at the same pace, turned the corner. Harry walked the rest of the way to his next class, considering what that meant, which he was not entirely sure, and suspected she had known he would not be. Potions occupied the dungeons in September, and a version of Snape that Harry had not anticipated. He had expected something. The rumors from older students had been specific enough about Snape's approach to favorites and non-favorites to give him a rough map. What he encountered instead was a silence that was not absence, but sustained attention, the particular silence of someone watching carefully and choosing not to comment on what they saw. The heating spell Snape required all first years to produce before they were permitted near a cauldron was simple. It was designed to be simple, a minimal spell for beginners requiring the most forgiving possible application of intent. Harry produced it without difficulty. The heat arrived in the air above his wand tip. 3 seconds after he intended it, the student to his left had produced the same heat, and it had arrived in the same instant as the intention. 3 seconds. Snape stood at the front of the room with his hands clasped behind his back and his black eyes moving across the class, and he noted it with the careful stillness of a man who has filed something in a place where he will find it again. He said nothing. He moved on to inspect cauldrons. He let Harry begin the lesson. He spoke about the potion they were making with the measured precision of someone who took the subject seriously, and at no point did he single Harry out for anything. Harry would come to understand over the following weeks that this was its own kind of attention. Being singled out was straightforward. Whatever Snape was doing was not straightforward. Quirrell taught defense with his back to the class for most of it, which Harry had been told to expect. Something about a smell. And when he did turn to face them, the purple turban made him look taller than he was, and his manner had the quality of a performance being given by someone who had prepared extensively for a different role. He set practice dummies on stands at the far end of the classroom, and asked the first years to attempt Wingardium Leviosa while he stood at the window and apparently watched the grounds. Harry's dummy rose cleanly and came down correctly on the other side of the room. He was certain of that. What he was also certain of was the half-second between his intention and the spell's arrival, the small pause where the wand assembled everything carefully, the way a student double-checks their work before turning it in. Half a second of lag in an otherwise clean result. Quirrell turned from the window. He looked at Harry with an expression that was not the scattered nerves of a nervous teacher. Then he turned back. Harry could not have described what he'd seen in that fraction of a turning, except that it had not been accidental. By the third week of term, Hermione had found 2 books on wand lore. That was how she described it, found in the particular tone she used for things the library had been withholding from the general student body until she located them. She read them at the library table on Thursday evenings, with the concentration of someone who had identified a problem and believed that the problem was answerable, if you read carefully enough. Harry and Ron occupied the adjacent chairs by then, out of settled habit, Ron working through whatever subject was due next, Harry reading ahead in the defense text and finding it less useful than it looked. The verdict arrived at the end of a Tuesday in late September. She closed the second book and looked at Harry with the expression of someone who had considered her findings carefully and decided they were ready for delivery. Unicorn hair cores produced the most consistent performance, she said. Least fluctuation. Most stable output. Most resistant to outside interference. Phoenix feather cores have the greatest range and power, but they're the hardest to work with because they respond to impulse rather than deliberate intention. They're described as the most independent of the 3 cores, which means they can produce extraordinary results. But they do it partly on their own terms. She paused. Your wand is more stable than the other one would have been, but it has a narrower ceiling. Ron set down the essay he was working on. So you swapped a wild one for a reliable one, he said to Harry. Something like that, Harry said. He meant it as a positive. He sat with it for a moment, and was not entirely sure it was. The question about Neville's wand arrived in late September in the corridor outside defense. Neville dropped his wand, walking out of the classroom, and Harry picked it up, a routine motion, half a second, and handed it back. In that half second, it felt entirely wrong in Harry's hand. Not wrong like a bad fit the way the first wands in Ollivander's had been wrong, each one producing its own small disaster. Wrong like this wand has already found its person, and that person is not either of us here in this corridor. The wrongness of something that belongs to someone else in a very specific way, a way that has nothing to do with the person who is currently holding it. Neville took it back with a quiet thanks and put it in his pocket, and they walked on to the great hall for dinner. He did not explain, and Harry did not ask. But the question followed Harry. Whose was it? It was old, the finish worn in the way of something used extensively and long. And Neville carried it with a particular carefulness that Harry had noticed before without having a word for. He filed the question away. He didn't have an answer yet. The note Snape wrote that October evening was not addressed to Dumbledore. He sat at his desk in the dungeon classroom, after the last potion session of the day, in the quiet that follows students leaving, and wrote 3 sentences. He looked at them. He crossed out the third and wrote something else in its place. He looked at that. He had seen worse wand work from first years. This was an accurate statement. He had seen students in his first year who could not produce a directed non-casting without endangering their own shoes, which was, at least, a form of commitment. Potter's work was not like that. It was careful. It arrived consistently, half a beat behind its own intention, which meant the wand was reliable, but the ceiling of that reliability had a specific height, and Snape had done enough observing to know approximately where that height was. He had also seen better from a student 20 years ago who had a wand that fitted the way very few wands fit anyone, and who had not needed to compensate for a gap, because there had been no gap. That was a less useful thought. He was aware it was less useful. He had a long practice of knowing which thoughts were less useful, and having them anyway. He folded the note and put it in the desk drawer. He was not certain what to do with what he had observed, or whether it was his decision to do anything. He was not certain what he owed the boy, if anything. He was not certain of several things. He closed the drawer. He left the note where it was. The note arrived between the main course and the pudding, delivered by a small school owl that circled Harry's head twice before dropping an envelope onto his plate and departing with the self-satisfied manner of something that had discharged its duty and expected no further involvement. Harry opened it under the table. The handwriting was a particular thing, long, looping, utterly legible, and conveying even in ink the impression of a mind that had been corresponding with people it found interesting for a very long time. The note said that he was invited to the headmaster's office this evening after dinner if he was not otherwise occupied, and that the gargoyle required a password which was presently Sherbet Lemon, and it was signed in full with all 4 names, which, Harry suspected, was Dumbledore's way of being precise about who had written it, in case there was any ambiguity on the subject. He folded the note and looked at Ron, who had watched the owl with the particular sideways attention of someone trying to appear as though he had not been watching. "I'll be back," Harry said, and left. The gargoyle at the base of the spiral staircase jumped aside when he gave the password, with the expression, as much as stone can be said to have an expression of something that had decided Harry was acceptable under the current administrative arrangement, and reserved the right to review this later. The staircase beyond moved slowly, the stone worn smooth at its edges in the way of something that had been doing this for centuries, carrying people up toward conversations they had not fully prepared for. Harry's wand. His hands were not exactly steady. The office was circular and larger than he had imagined. The windows were tall. Outside one of them, the sky had gone dark with the particular decisiveness of an October evening that was done being evening and had moved on to being night. Along the curved walls stood shelves full of instruments Harry had no name for. Small silver mechanisms, each turning or oscillating or emitting something that occupied the space between sound and silence, quiet enough that you felt them rather than heard them. The portraits in their gilded frames held sleeping figures who were, Harry noticed, sleeping with the careful precision of people who had been awake a moment ago and intended to be awake again shortly. A battered old hat sat on a shelf above the mantelpiece, and on a perch beside the tallest window, in the lamplight and the dark, sat a bird unlike anything Harry had encountered in 11 years of life. It was large. Not the size of an eagle, larger than that, larger than felt reasonable for something that sat on a perch and regarded the room with its eyes, and it was brilliant in the way of things that produced their own quality of light rather than simply receiving it. Crimson and gold and amber, the red of old fire, the gold of something that has not yet cooled. Its tail feathers trailed to the floor, bright as anything Harry had ever looked at directly, and it watched him with black eyes that were very steady, and seemed to be measuring something he could not identify. Sherbet Lemon. Dumbledore said. He was already extending a small glass dish from somewhere behind the desk. Harry took one, sat down in the chair that was clearly meant for him, and tried not to look at the bird constantly. He failed, which Dumbledore appeared to find acceptable rather than impolite. "Fawkes," Dumbledore said, in the tone of a man who had said this name many times to many people and found it a complete statement on its own. "Is he a phoenix?" "He is." Dumbledore settled the dish of sweets to one side and folded his long hands on the desk. He was wearing deep plum robes, and his silver beard caught the lamplight with the quiet authority of something that had been silver for longer than most things had been anything. Fawkes is a creature of considerable opinions, most of which he chooses not to share. I have had his company for many decades. We have developed an understanding which is perhaps not the same as agreement. He left a brief space in the air. How are your classes proceeding, Mr. Potter? Harry had not expected this question, which was perhaps why he answered it honestly, that, and the quality of Dumbledore's listening, which was the kind that made dishonesty feel beside the point. He said, Transfiguration was going well mostly, Potions was interesting, though Snape was difficult to read, Defense was fine. His wand in defense practice was consistently half a beat behind his intention. Not wrong, not inaccurate, just slightly delayed in a way that became visible when speed mattered, which was increasingly often. In Transfiguration, it had required 2 attempts where one would have sufficed for the other students. He said this evenly, which was the only way he had found to say it, without it sounding like a complaint or an excuse. It was the situation. Dumbledore listened with the full attention of someone who was not merely processing what Harry said, but filing it alongside things he already knew, which gave the listening a quality of weight that Harry found reassuring in a way he could not have explained. When Harry had finished, Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. I imagine, he said, that you are wondering whether I am disappointed in your decision. Harry thought about this. I wasn't, he said. Something moved through Dumbledore's expression. Not quite amusement, not quite something else. Then let me say clearly, before I say anything further, I am not disappointed. I want to be precise about this because what I am about to tell you might sound like disappointment, and it would be unfortunate if you heard it that way. He paused. I am uncertain, which is, in my experience, a considerably more interesting state than disappointment. Disappointment concerns itself with what you wished had happened. Uncertainty asks what comes next. Harry looked at the sherbet lemon in his hand, and then ate it, which gave him a moment to think. You have not asked, Dumbledore said, where the feathers in your wands came from. In your wand, and in the one you declined, both feathers came from the same phoenix, Dumbledore said. He did not look at Fawkes, he looked at Harry. The phoenix on that perch behind me. Fawkes gave exactly 2 tail feathers to Ollivander's keeping some years ago for the purpose of wand-making. Those 2 feathers, and only those 2, became the cause of the wands that have concerned us ever since. One became the wand that has been used since 1926 by the man who gave you your scar. The other became the wand Ollivander offered you in July. The fire in the grate shifted. Fawkes did not move. Harry sat with this for a moment, feeling its edges. So when Ollivander said the phoenix, he meant yours. He just didn't say so. Ollivander is a man of exact precision. The bird was, at that point, mine to identify or not. Ollivander stated what was accurate. He did not say everything that was accurate. Those are separate decisions. Dumbledore's voice was even. I am telling you now because you are owed the information, and because it changes the shape of the question you have been asking yourself since August. Did you know? Harry asked. There was a pause that had a specific quality, not the pause of someone deciding what to say, but the pause of someone who had already decided many times and was deciding again. Fawkes gave those feathers of his own choosing, Dumbledore said at last. A phoenix cannot be directed to give a tail feather. He can be trusted, he can be kept, in the way that keeping a phoenix means anything at all. He cannot be instructed in the matter of what to give and when and to whom. Fawkes decided, In his own time and according to his own sense of things, the two feathers should go into the world by way of Ollivander's craft. I did not tell him to. He stopped. Then I allowed it. I have spent considerable time since July examining the distance between those two things, and I find it smaller than it once appeared. Outside, an autumn wind moved against the window. Harry looked at the bird on the perch, who looked back. "If the wand chose me," Harry said, "was I wrong to refuse it?" He had not asked this of anyone before now. He had carried it since the train back to Little Whinging in July, since the first night at the Dursleys, when he lay awake holding the Vinewood wand, and tried to decide if the steadiness in his hand was the same thing as rightness. He asked it now, because Dumbledore was the only person in the world who might give him an answer built from true things, rather than from what Harry needed to hear. Dumbledore considered the question with the thoroughness it deserved. "The wand, choosing a wizard," he said, "is a statement about nature. It is not a contract, and it is not a command. The Holy One chose you first, and most powerfully. That is information about what kind of magic you are capable of, what will come to you most readily over the course of your life. The fact of that choosing is real and will not change, because you set the wand on a chair and stepped away from it." He looked at Harry over the rim of his spectacles with the careful directness of someone who had learned, through long practice, that precision is the only real kindness. "Your refusal is also information. It tells me, and it tells you, if you pay attention, something about what you will not permit yourself to become and what principles you will hold, regardless of convenience." A pause, measured and deliberate. Both of these things are true at the same time. I do not think one cancels the other. Whether the two of them together amount to wisdom or to an unnecessary complication is a question I cannot answer for you. And I will be honest and tell you that I am not certain I could answer it for myself. I suspect, Mr. Potter, that you will find out before I do. Harry left with more questions than he had brought with him, which he was beginning to think was the nature of conversations with Dumbledore. He went down the spiral staircase in the particular quiet of someone who has been handed an enormous amount to think about and has not yet found the beginning of it. The gargoyle watched him go with the manner of something that was now, formerly, neither impressed nor unimpressed. Harry walked back toward Gryffindor Tower, with the wand in his pocket, and Dumbledore's honest uncertainty settled in his chest, which was, he decided, partway down a corridor of torchlit paintings, not the worst thing a person could carry. He had not expected the headmaster to not know. Somehow, that made it better. Behind him, in the circular office, Fawkes turned on his perch with the slow, final deliberateness of a creature that had witnessed something and was deciding whether it was finished. His brilliant tail feathers swept the wood of the perch. His black eyes rested on the door Harry had gone through, and then on the dark square of window, and then on some middle distance that was his own. He made no sound. He kept his own counsel, as he had always done, as he would continue to do long after everyone in this conversation had finished drawing their conclusions. The thing about teaching, Quirrell had decided by the middle of October, was that it required a presence of mind he could no longer quite claim as entirely his own. He managed. He prepared his lesson notes in the evenings, arranged the classroom furniture in the mornings, smiled at students in the particular way of a man who found them tolerable on the surface and had other things to think about beneath it. He set up his demonstration materials and sent the class through their exercises, and walked between the rows and corrected wand grip with the detachment of someone performing a well-rehearsed function. His turban sat on his head in the way it always sat, which was to say, wound carefully, secured, hiding what it hid. Some of the students found it odd. He had told them it was a gift from an African prince. The lie was one of the smaller ones he told every day, and he had stopped noticing its weight. The thing he could not entirely manage was the cold place at the back of his skull. It was not painful, precisely. It was more like a second awareness, a consciousness that occupied the same space as his own thoughts, and was under no obligation to announce itself before commenting. When Quirrell taught, he was aware of the other awareness watching alongside him. When Quirrell observed his students, he was aware that the observation was being conducted by two sets of eyes through one pair of lenses. He had grown used to this. He was not sure "used to" was the right phrase. He had grown accustomed, in the way that a limb grows accustomed to a wound that has been there long enough to be expected. The other awareness had opinions about everything. About the school year, about the obstacles below the trapdoor he had already begun to investigate, about the timeline that was slowly becoming a deadline, about Harry Potter. The wand situation, the other awareness had concluded, was considerably more useful than it had first appeared. Quirrell had thought about this himself in the days after the news from Diagon Alley reached him through the leaky cauldron's ambient gossip. The twin core problem, the priori incantatum complication, the possibility of wands from the same phoenix refusing to properly duel, golden threads, and the dead returning, and the entire sequence of complications that a direct confrontation might have produced, had been a variable Quirrell had noted. He had not known quite what to do with it. Now the problem had resolved itself, because the boy had resolved it. Without the twin-core wand, the priori incantatum effect could not occur. The boy's alternative wand had no relationship to the Dark Lords. There was nothing in that unicorn hair that would recognize the phoenix feather across the distance of a duel and refuse to fight it. No enforced replay of recent spells, no magical bridge built of grief and memory. What the boy had refused for the sake of principle was also, from another angle, a protection he had refused for the sake of principle. This was ironic, in a way that the other awareness in Quirrell's skull found almost elegant. Useful, came the thought, arriving in the cold register it always used, not quite sound, not quite pressure, but with a weight to it that Quirrell had learned to feel as certainty rather than suggestion. The boy is without the one wand-level advantage he could have had, and he gave it up himself. But also, the boy is emotional. He chose with his heart, which he has in abundance, rather than with his head, which he has not yet learned to use. He will do this again. This, Quirrell thought privately, might be the more important observation. He demonstrated it to himself in his defense classes. In late October, he moved the first years through a series of precision exercises, controlled summoning, directional hover charms, a levitation sequence that required maintained intention rather than a single cast undone. It was a lesson designed to measure something specific, though the students understood it only as a lesson. He watched from the front of the room, with his back at the usual angle, his attention appearing to rest on the window, his awareness resting on the class. Potter's wand produced results. This was, Quirrell had established across multiple weeks of watching the important qualification to understand about the alternative choice. It worked. The unicorn hair core was stable, as such cores always were, and the vine wood cooperated with reasonable consistency. Spells arrived where they were directed. Precision was not the problem. The problem was the ceiling. In a simple exercise, Potter's results were clean, adequate, sometimes excellent, always reliable. When Quirrell pushed the class towards something that required more, a sudden surge of output, a spell with an unusually steep demand, something designed for a moment of emergency rather than a moment of practice. The gap opened quietly. Potter managed. He was neither the weakest nor the strongest in the room on any given exercise. But the wand ran close to its capacity in those moments, in a way that a phoenix feather core would not have run close to capacity, because phoenix feather cores did not have the same ceiling. They had range. They had the kind of reach that appeared in a crisis as though called Potter's wand had reliability. Reliability was worth a great deal. In an emergency requiring everything, it was worth somewhat less. The other awareness observed this with the satisfaction of a calculation completing itself. In a sustained duel, the boy's wand would hold. In a sudden confrontation that required a burst of power beyond the ordinary, the kind of confrontation that tended to arise in underground chambers, in the dark, in front of an enchanted mirror, the gap would matter. The timeline, therefore, was what it was. Quirrell spent his evenings in his office, which was a small room on the 3rd floor that smelled persistently of garlic, his own addition for reasons he did not discuss with colleagues, and which contained the usual professor's detritus of unmarked essays, reference texts, and a desk he had never properly organized. After the last evening meal, when the corridors had gone quiet, he sat at the desk and thought about the trap door and the 7 layers of what lay beneath it. He had been past the first layer. He understood, in outline, what the subsequent layers required. He was still working on the specifics of the 6th layer, which Dumbledore had keyed to the Mirror of Erest, and which revealed nothing useful when Quirrell stood in front of it, except the reflection of a man wearing a turban and looking increasingly like someone who had made an agreement he was beginning to regret. One evening in November, he found the school's academic records unlocked. A small administrative oversight, or perhaps an oversight of a different kind, and looked at the first-year files. Nothing secret, nothing that was not, in principle, available to any member of staff. Student profiles, class performance notes, early assessment marks. He read the transfiguration note about Potter, 2 attempts, where 1 sufficed, a note in McGonagall's handwriting that was precise without being cruel, which was McGonagall's characteristic register in everything she wrote. Quirrell told himself this meant very little. A first-year student taking 2 attempts at a match-to-needle transformation was not a disaster. Most students took 3 or 4, or lost the needle entirely. The other awareness did not respond to this, which was its own response. It meant, this confirms what we already know, and we will not forget it. Quirrell closed the file and sat for a while in the smell of garlic and the particular silence of a castle at night, which was a silence that was never quite silent. Portraits murmuring in distant corridors, staircases choosing to rearrange themselves, the castle's own slow awareness shifting around them. He thought briefly, and with less control than he would have liked, about the version of himself that had agreed to this. The man who had sought out the Dark Lord in Albania, who had found something that was not quite a man and not quite a ghost, who had understood the terms before he accepted them, and had accepted them anyway. He thought about what he had told himself that agreement was worth. He stopped thinking about it because the other awareness grew colder when he did, which was the voice's version of attention. He went to bed. The other awareness did not require sleep and did not participate in it, but it allowed Quirrell the function of it. He was sometimes grateful for this. The defense class in late November ran long. Quirrell set a new exercise, directional Expelliarmus, which was beyond the standard first-year curriculum and which he had introduced as supplementary, a stretching exercise for the more capable students. He demonstrated it once and watched the class attempt it. Potter succeeded. He succeeded on the 2nd attempt, which was faster than 3/4 of the class managed. The spell fired correctly reached its target A padded dummy Quirrell had positioned at the far end of the room, and the dummy's conjured wand spun away from its holder as intended. Afterward, walking back toward his dormitory with Granger and Weasley, Potter held his wand at his side in the manner of someone who was not quite finished with it yet. Quirrell noticed from the window of his classroom as the first years filed out the particular way Potter's wand hand was positioned, not tight, not dropped, but held at an angle that suggested the hand knew the wand had done something close to its limit and was giving it a moment. The wand had run warm. Quirrell could not see this from the window. He understood it from the residue of a spell pushed toward its ceiling, and from the knowledge of what a unicorn hair core felt like from the outside when it had been asked for more than it easily gave. Potter did not mention it to his friends. Quirrell watched the three of them disappear down the corridor. He waited until the corridor was empty. Then he pulled the window closed and turned back to the room, and thought about a trapdoor on the 3rd floor and a dog with 3 heads that had to be put to sleep before anything else could begin, and about a timeline. The stone had to come first, before the gap narrowed further, before practice and stubbornness and whatever the boy was growing into made the calculation harder. The Dark Lord's patience was not infinite. He was very tired. He had been very tired for some time. Harry noticed Neville's wand arm in herbology on a Wednesday in November, in the middle of a practical that required a minor growth encouragement charm on a pot of particularly stubborn mandrake seedlings. It was not that Neville was bad at herbology. He was, if anything, the opposite. He handled the seedlings with an ease that the rest of the class conspicuously lacked, talking to them quietly as he worked, his movements in the soil competent and unself-conscious. The problem was not herbology. The problem was the moment when Professor Sprout asked them to apply the charm and Neville raised his wand. Harry had watched other students cast the same charm for the last 20 minutes. He had watched Ron cast it twice, both times with the specific combination of confidence and imprecision that Ron brought to most spell work. He had watched Hermione cast it with the focused attention of someone who had already read about this charm and was confirming what she expected. He had watched the general scatter of the class, the hesitant and the enthusiastic, and the people who were somewhere between. He had watched enough to understand what a first-year student with a new wand looked like while casting. Neville's arm was different in a specific way that Harry took several seconds to find a word for, and the word he found was wrong-sided. Not hesitant, Neville could be hesitant about everything, and this was not hesitance. It was the particular wrongness of a left-handed person writing with their right hand at someone else's instruction. The wand did not resist exactly, it just did not follow with the ease that following should look like. The charm produced a small greenish flicker. The seedling responded with what might have been encouragement. Professor Sprout moved on down the row without comment. Harry looked at his own wand for a moment and then looked away. He did not ask about it that day. He carried the observation through the afternoon and through dinner and into the Gryffindor common room, where it stayed with him through half an hour of watching the fire and the room around it, and then he asked it. "Neville," he said, in a break between one thing and nothing in particular. Neville was sitting across the low table from him, working through a herbology essay with the focused satisfaction of someone engaged in something they understood well. "Your wand in class today, does it feel right to you?" The room did not go quiet. The fire kept going. Ron looked up from his chessboard briefly and then looked back down. Hermione's page turned. Neville went very still, not startled, not the flinch of someone caught out. A different kind of stillness. The stillness of someone who had been waiting for a question they were not sure they wanted answered, and had not expected to come from here. It lasted long enough for Harry to understand that he had made a social error of some kind, and not long enough for him to figure out how to correct it. Then Neville said, "It was my dad's." He said it the way you say something that has been true for a very long time and has not stopped being difficult for the duration. He looked at the essay in front of him as he said it. My gran thought it would be meaningful to have something of his. He paused. She wasn't wrong, exactly. Harry did not ask what had happened to his dad. The sentence had a shape to it, the shape of something that had happened badly and stayed happened, and Harry understood that shape from his own life, even if the specifics were entirely different. You did not ask. You waited. Neville looked up from the essay after a moment. It mostly works, he said, which was the specific kind of understatement that required some precision to produce. Just not exactly. Not the way I think it's supposed to. No, Harry said. I know what that's like. Neville looked at him. So Harry told him. Not the version that was circulating through the school, not the one where the wand was extremely rare, or decades old, or arranged by Dumbledore personally. Not the story-shaped version with its convenient details. What it had felt like when the Holy Wand produced those sparks, immediate, complete, like something finally recognizing him that he had not known was failing to recognize him before. What had changed in the space between that feeling and hearing Ollivander's next words? Why he had set the wand down, which had not been strategy or cleverness, but something much simpler. He had looked at the connection being offered and decided he would rather carry an imperfect alternative his entire life than accept a wand that shared anything with the man who had killed his parents. He told Neville what Ollivander had said when the Vinewood wand settled into his hand, not perfect, but willing. He said all of this evenly, which was the only way he had found to say it that did not require the other person to manage his feelings about it. He was not asking for anything with the telling. He was giving Neville something to put beside his own version, because it seemed like Neville might need something to put it beside. Neville listened with the particular attention of someone who has been handed something that does not quite fit, and told to manage, and who has been managing, and who has not heard anyone speak plainly about the management until now. That's... Neville started, and then did not finish the sentence, which was the right decision. There was nothing to finish it with that would be adequate. Yeah, Harry said. For a while after that, they did not say anything. Then, without quite deciding to, they both put their wands on the table between them. 2 wands on worn wood in the common room light, Harry's pale and birch-coloured with its quiet vinewood grain, Neville's darker, the wood a richer brown and worn in the way of something that had been used extensively by someone else for a long time before it arrived here. They practiced the same charm in turn. Not coaching each other, there was no instruction offered, and none requested. They simply practiced. Neville's version produced a small flicker of greenish light on the second try and on the third, and by the fourth it had acquired a steadiness that might, with a great deal of time, become something more than that. Harry's version was clean and adequate and consistently arrived on the first attempt. Adequate, that was the word for it. He had decided adequate was enough and had been correct almost every time he checked. Ron watched from the armchair without commenting, which was not in curiosity. Ron noticed most things, but a kind of courtesy that Harry was discovering was one of Ron's characteristic generosities. The willingness to leave a thing alone when leaving it alone was the useful response. He moved a bishop on the chessboard and watched the bishop proceed across 3 squares of its own initiative and said nothing about wands. Hermione read. She had an opinion. Harry had grown sufficiently accustomed to Hermione in the last 2 months to know that she had read the relevant sections of at least 2 wand lore texts and could have delivered a 7-sentence summary of the wandwork issues visible in both of their casting styles, and that she was choosing not to, which was its own kind of discipline and should not be mistaken for indifference. The fire settled. The common room carried on. Older students, at the far tables, a group of second years, doing something noisy near the window that quieted down when a prefect looked in their direction, someone's cat asleep in a chair. That was technically 4 people. November outside the windows had committed fully to the project of being cold and dark and had nothing further to offer on the subject. This was the nicest evening Harry had spent indoors in his memory. It was made of nothing except firelight and 2 imperfect wands, and other people who were tolerating imperfection without remark. And it was, he realized with a faint surprise enough, not because the imperfection was unimportant or because nothing was hard, because of the particular quality of being left to manage it in company. 2 boys, born at the end of July, a day apart, one on the 30th, one on the 31st, both in Gryffindor, both in the middle of a year shaped by forces they could not fully see. Pas de pas, both carrying wands that did not fit the way wands were supposed to fit, for different reasons that the world had handed them without much consultation. They did not know this was a pattern. There was no reason for them to know. The world contained this echo and had not told either of them what to make of it, because the world does not generally offer that kind of annotation. Neville went up to bed at 9:30, saying good night with the unceremonious ease of someone who had moved, over the course of an evening, from being a round-faced boy across a table to being something more settled and harder to name. Harry said good night. Neville's footsteps disappeared up the dormitory stairs. Harry stayed, not because he had anything left to do. The fire was lower now, and the common room was quieter, and he was sitting with his wand in his hand simply because it felt like the right place to have it. He looked out the window at the November grounds, dark and defined only by what the castle's outer torches could reach. The edge of the lawn, the beginning of the trees, the outline of things that became shapeless past a certain distance. His wand was steady in his hand. It had been steady all evening. It was always steady. He had made his choice in August with the certainty of someone who knew exactly what they were refusing, even if they did not yet know what they were choosing. And the wand he had chosen was this: vinewood, unicorn hair, 10 3/4 inches, slightly yielding, not perfect, but willing. And this was what willing looked like in practice, showing up, holding steady, being adequate. He had decided this was enough. He held the wand in the dark, and almost by now believed it. The Great Hall at Halloween was the kind of spectacle that required a genuine effort of will not to stare at, which was perhaps why it was so easy to notice the thing at the Gryffindor table that was not quite right. The ceiling was full of live bats, hundreds of them, arranged in patterns that Dumbledore's magic kept in motion, swooping and reorganizing in a way that was either beautiful or alarming, depending on temperament. 1,000 jack-o'-lanterns floated above the tables, each carved and lit in ways that candlelight alone could not have achieved, their orange glow competing pleasantly with the bats. The food was traditional and excellent. The hall was full of first years who were still learning not to be openly impressed by things like this, with uneven results. Hermione Granger was not at the feast. Harry knew why. He had not been present for the thing Ron had said, something in the corridor outside Charms, something that had carried the casual cruelty of a comment not intended to wound as badly as it did, but he had been told about it afterward in pieces. And he had been watching Ron not look at the empty seat across the table for the last 20 minutes and doing nothing about it, because it was not his to do anything about, and he was 11 years old, and not sure what to do anyway. Ron ate. He ate with the slightly mechanical quality of someone managing something by keeping his hands occupied. There was a crash at the door. The doors of the great hall burst open, which produced a silence that fell across the entire room in the sudden way of something unexpected, and Professor Quirrell stumbled inside. He was in his defense robes, and his purple turban was askew, and he was moving in the manner of a man who was not so much entering a room as being propelled through its entrance by something behind him. He reached the center of the hall, looked at the students with an expression of genuine theatrical distress, and announced in a voice that wavered through several registers, "Troll in the dungeons. Thought you ought to know." He fainted. The ensuing noise was immediate and comprehensive. Dumbledore was on his feet. Prefects were being directed. The table was being told to move by year and by house in an orderly fashion, which the hall interpreted as an instruction to move all at once, which was not orderly at all. Harry was swept along with the Gryffindors moving toward the staircase, in a crowd that pushed and sorted itself in the way that crowds do, and it was in this movement that the thought arriving the way necessary thoughts do in a crush. Hermione was in a bathroom somewhere. Hermione had not been at dinner, and had no way of knowing that there was a mountain troll in the building. He stopped. The crowd moved past him. "We have to tell her," he said to Ron. Ron looked at him. He said nothing about the corridor outside charms, about the 20 minutes of looking at an empty seat, about any of it. He said, "Yeah," and they turned and went the other way. The corridor was not empty. Students were still moving through it in the directed chaos of a partial evacuation, but it was thinning by the time Harry and Ron reached the landing outside the second-floor girls' bathroom, which was where a first-year Gryffindor girl had told them Hermione sometimes went when she needed to be away from things. Harry had not known this about the second-floor girls' bathroom before tonight. He would not forget it after they smelled the troll before they saw it. The smell was something between rotting vegetation and the particular sourness of something very large that had never made any particular effort toward hygiene. Harry would later understand this as characteristic of mountain trolls, which averaged 12 feet in height, dull grey skin like old stone, and a general approach to their surroundings as things to be walked through rather than around. The bathroom door was partly open, the troll was partly through it. Harry looked at Ron. They went in anyway. Hermione was in the corner, cornered in the literal sense. The corner of the bathroom was the furthest she could get from the troll, which occupied most of the room, its enormous flat feet having already crushed the row of sinks closest to the door, and its club dragging across the tiles with a sound like a millstone. She was pressed against the wall, and she looked at Harry and Ron with the expression of someone who has been very frightened for long enough that the fright has resolved into a kind of hard, terrified clarity. The troll was raising its club in the directionless way of large, unintelligent things that are aware something in their vicinity has irritated them. Harry said the only spell that presented itself. Wingardium Leviosa, the levitation charm, aimed at the club, and the wand responded. It responded with the particular diligence that he had come to understand as its signature, careful, considered, arriving a half-beat behind the intent. The club rose. It rose correctly, left the troll's hand, went up at an angle that should have brought it around and down onto the troll's own head, which was the outcome Harry's instinct had reached for. But the charm did not have the surge capacity the moment required. It had the consistency it always had, and consistency was not the same as force, and the club went up, and the arc fell short, and the club came down sideways, striking the bathroom wall with a crack that sent dust and plaster into the air, and left the troll startled rather than insensible. The troll turned toward Harry, There was a moment, very short, the kind that only feels long because it contains a decision. And then Harry did the only thing that remained, which was not a plan, but an instinct. He caught its arm as it swung, used the momentum to go up rather than sideways, and was on the troll's back before the mathematics of what he was doing could become fully apparent to him. He drove his wand upward into the troll's nose, which was the only soft target his hand could find from where he was, and which proved, in a very immediate and practical sense, to be effective. The troll sat down. It did not sit down deliberately. Sitting down was simply what happened to something very large when all higher functions stopped operating at once. Harry came down with it, which would have been worse if the troll had not provided a substantial amount of surface area to land on. He rolled clear. He was on the bathroom floor. The floor was wet and unpleasant, and he was on it, and the troll was motionless, and this was the situation. Ron was shaking. Not from cold. He had his own wand in his hand, and his face had gone very white in the way of someone who has just discovered that fear and action happen at the same time. And it is not possible to wait for the fear to pass before acting. Hermione said, in a voice that was completely even, in a way that indicated she was working very hard to make it completely even, "Is everyone?" "Yeah," Harry said from the floor. "Yeah." He lay there for another moment and looked at the ceiling, which had survived the troll's visit with more dignity than the sinks had, and breathed. The professors arrived within moments of each other. McGonagall came through the door first, her black robes sharp, and her expression doing several things simultaneously. Behind her came Flitwick, who took in the scene with the concentrated attention of a very small person, making sure he has understood what he is seeing correctly. And then Snape. He came last, which Harry would not have registered as notable, except that he came in from the direction of the upper floors rather than from the staircase below, and he was walking in the particular way of a man managing a pain in his leg. Not limping exactly, but compensating, his weight distributed with a care that was not his usual manner. His dark eyes moved across the bathroom. The troll, the ruined sinks, Harry on the floor, Hermione in the corner, Ron still holding his wand. He looked at Harry. He looked, then, at Harry's wand. Lying on the tile where Harry had dropped it in the landing, he looked at the walls of the bathroom. Someone with the right eyes could read a casting from its residue, the trajectory, the correction, the place where the spell had adjusted because the first arc had fallen short. 2 seconds, perhaps 3. Then Snape's eyes moved away from the wand to Flitwick, and he said nothing. Hermione had gathered herself by this point, or had gathered enough of herself to produce a functional version. She told McGonagall that she had gone looking for the troll herself, that she had heard about it, thought she could handle it, and that Harry and Ron had come to find her when they realized where she was. She said this with the calm of someone who has decided on a story and is presenting it, which was not quite the same as the calm of someone who is not frightened. McGonagall's expression moved through several things. She took house points and assigned caution with the even hand of someone who is under the professionalism. Genuinely relieved. Flitwick's eyes were bright. Snape's face gave nothing. The three of them walked in the manner of people who have been moving very fast and are now being asked to move slowly, and whose bodies have not yet caught up with the transition. Hermione was between Harry and Ron, and she was not speaking, which Harry understood as she was still working through what had happened, and did not want company inside it yet. Ron glanced at her once sideways and said nothing. Harry noticed his hand was trembling. Not from the fear of the troll, or not only from that. From the particular exhaustion of having asked the wand for what the moment required, and found that the wand had given what it could, and what it could had not been quite enough, and he had bridged the gap with his own body instead, and his hand knew this, even if he had not yet fully processed it. The wand was back in his pocket, and his hand was trembling, and he put the hand in his other pocket and kept walking. He did not mention the trembling. By the time they reached the tower, Hermione and Ron were talking. Not in the way they had talked before had been careful and slightly adversarial, in the way of two people circling something they disagreed about, but in the way of people who have been through the same thing and are now in the same room of it, without the need to negotiate whose room it is. Ron was describing what it had looked like from his angle, which was the angle of someone who had been trying to think of a useful spell and had not managed before Harry had climbed a troll, and the description was characteristically direct, and Hermione was listening and then describing what it had looked like from her angle, which was the angle of someone who had thought she was about to die and had watched two people run toward that possibility anyway. Harry walked beside them and watched this happen, and felt the specific satisfaction of something going right that had been not quite right before. He could not have explained why it mattered to him as much as it did, why the sound of those two voices finding a way to occupy the same conversation produced something almost physical, somewhere in his chest that he had not been expecting. He did not examine it, he kept walking, and his hand slowly stopped shaking, and the three of them went up to the tower together. The months between Halloween and Christmas had a particular quality that Harry would later understand as the quality of a thing you are in the middle of and cannot yet see from the outside. He practiced. That was the simplest way to say it. He had not made a plan or set a schedule. He had simply found that when he held the vinewood wand and cast in the practice rooms or the empty corridor or the far end of the dormitory after lights out, the gap between intention and arrival was narrowing, not closed. He was not going to close it in 6 months, what 10 years of proper training might have narrowed over a lifetime. He had accepted this, but narrowing in the way that repetition narrows things, through patient accumulation. By December, the half-second lag in defense had become a quarter-second. By February, it was a variable rather than a constant, present in unfamiliar spells, nearly absent in those he had worked through enough times to have them in his hands rather than only in his head. McGonagall noticed. She said nothing directly, which was her characteristic form of commentary on things she considered correct. She simply did not write anything further in her register, and once, in January, glanced at the result of Harry's transfiguration practical, with an expression that might, from a distance, have resembled satisfaction. Snape noticed. Harry could not have said when he became certain of this, because Snape's noticing was not a thing he made observable. It was more that the particular quality of the attention Snape had been directing at Harry's wand hand all term was slightly different by February. Less cataloguing, perhaps. Less like counting a deficit. Harry was not sure what to make of this, and filed it alongside several other things about Snape that he had found himself unable to adequately interpret. He did not think about it too much, because there was Quidditch. Wood had put him on the team in late September, youngest seeker in a century. A piece of information that had embarrassed Harry considerably when it got out, and had done nothing to reduce the number of people who wanted to discuss his wand in the common room. On a broomstick, none of that mattered, which was the most immediately relevant fact about being on a broomstick. The wand stayed in his pocket. The broom went where he asked. The air did what air did, which was to be cold and necessary. And Harry was better at this than he had been at anything in his life, and there was no qualification attached to that. No lag, no ceiling, no narrower range. He was extraordinary in the sky, in the uncomplicated way that needed no defense or apology. The contrast did not escape him. He thought about it sometimes, when he was coming down from practice in the grey November air, what it would feel like to be this certain of himself. On the ground he had no answer. He thought, you work with what you have. Then he thought about dinner and stopped. The first Quidditch match was in November. He was 20 feet up, angling toward the opposite end of the pitch, where something golden had flickered at the corner of his vision when his broom tried to throw him off. Not mechanical failure. He knew what turbulence felt like. And this was not that. This was intentional, the broom bucking in the controlled, specific way of something that has been interfered with at the level of its enchantment, his grip wrenching sideways, his legs clamping the handle on instinct, while his stomach went somewhere that was not his body. He held on. He had been holding on all year in one sense or another, and he was quite good at it by now. Below him in the stands, somewhere in the mass of students in green and red and the cold weather variations of both, something was being addressed. He didn't know this yet. What he knew was that his broom kept trying to pitch him left, and that he kept not going left, and that after roughly 60 seconds of this, the bucking stopped entirely, and the golden snitch reappeared at eye level 3 feet from his face. In the celebration afterward, Hermione told him about the muttering professor in the stands. The description she gave was specific enough that there was no ambiguity about who. She did not say what she had done about it. Harry gathered, from the way she said it, and from the way she did not say certain things, that Snape's involvement had been interrupted rather than merely observed. He said nothing that night to anyone about what he thought. What he thought was, so that is what that looks like. He tucked it away. It joined the other things about Snape that didn't fit the picture Harry had assembled of him, and the picture got more complicated, and Harry decided the picture required more information before he reached any conclusions. Christmas at Hogwarts was warm and small, and the first one Harry had spent in a building that was decorated for it, rather than in spite of it. He stayed along with Ron and a few others. He received an invisibility cloak in anonymous wrapping from a person he did not identify until much later. He used it, because not using it would have been impossible once it existed. And on a January night, deep in the restricted section with the cloak pulled around him, Hermione found the name they had been looking for since November. Nicholas Flamel, French alchemist. 665 years old in the school year's calendar, known for only one thing in the modern magical record, and that one thing was the Philosopher's Stone, the stone that was in the school. After that, the investigation had a shape. It was Hermione who traced the research, who found the wand lore texts and the alchemical references, and who could say, at any given moment, exactly what they knew, and exactly what they didn't know. It was Ron who understood the logic of it, the way he understood chess. The layered protection under the trapdoor had a sequence, and sequences had structure, and structure could be mapped if you thought about what each piece was designed to protect against. Fluffy was the entry. Below that, layers designed for different kinds of unwanted visitor. Puzzles, challenges. He worked through them in his head the way he worked through an endgame, not all at once, but piece by piece, accounting for what each element implied about what came before and after. Harry contributed stubbornness, which was not a negligible thing. He was the one who went back to questions after everyone else had accepted them as unanswerable. He was the one who noticed that the stone's protection had been designed for someone attempting to find it and use it, not for the specific case of a professor who already had the run of the school and had been quietly mapping every obstacle since September. He said this on a February evening in the library and watched Hermione stop reading and look at the table for a long moment, and then look at him. "Someone is going to try to get to it," she said. "Someone already knows how to get past most of it," Harry said. They had been circling Quirrell for weeks by then. The suspicion had assembled itself piece by piece. The turban, the absence in corridors where he should have been present, the particular way he moved through certain parts of the castle, third floor mostly, with the manner of someone who had business there and wanted it to appear as though he did not. Harry watched him in defense class, with the awareness of someone who knew he was being watched in return. Quirrell, in parallel, was finishing. He had mapped all 7 layers of the protection by spring, the 3-headed dog that music could put to sleep, the devil's snare in the chamber below, the winged keys in the vault beyond, the wizard's chessboard that required a real game with real stakes, the troll in its chamber, the potion logic puzzle before the black fire. 6 of 7, understood and penetrable, given enough preparation. The 7th, what Dumbledore had placed in the mirror of Arised, remained opaque, because the mirror showed Quirrell himself reaching for the stone and not taking it, which was useless, and what the voice at the back of his skull said about this was cold and precise and urgent. The timeline had become a deadline. In May, Hagrid hatched a dragon. It was a Norwegian ridgeback, which managed to be both magnificent and catastrophic in roughly equal measure, and it grew at the rate that things in stories do when they have been introduced to create a problem, which is to say, Harry, Ron, and Hermione were caught out of bed at midnight on the tower, arranging its transport to Charlie Weasley's colleagues in Romania, and lost enough house points to make Percy Weasley visibly miserable for a week, and to earn them a detention in the Forbidden Forest. Hagrid was devastated. He said this several times in the way that Hagrid said things he felt deeply, which was with full volume and the specific anguish of a large man who has not yet found a way to reduce the size of what he is feeling. Harry told him it was all right, which was not entirely true, but was the thing that seemed most necessary at the time. The Forbidden Forest in May, at night, was a different thing than the Forbidden Forest at any other time. The trees were old enough that their canopy blocked whatever moonlight had been available above it, and the paths were narrow and lit by Hagrid's lantern, and the dark beyond the lantern's reach was the kind of dark that had things in it. They had been sent to find an injured unicorn. Hagrid moved with them for a while, his pink umbrella swinging and his conversation low, and directed at keeping everyone calm, and then the group split in the way that groups split in forests at night. Not all at once, but by degrees, paths diverging, and Harry was alone with a centaur named Ronan, and then with nothing but the trees, then with something else. The cloaked figure was in the clearing before he was. He felt the scar before he understood what he was seeing, the burning flare of it above his eye, sudden and specific, like a match struck against his forehead. In the moonlight, that filtered through the gap in the canopy. The figure was bent over something pale on the ground. The sound it made was not a human sound. The pale thing was a unicorn. Harry understood, later, that what he had felt was the proximity of something that had been using unicorn blood to remain alive, which was a thing a person only did when they had no other means and no concern for the cost. He understood, later, the cold logic of what it meant for something to need the blood of a magical creature of perfect innocence to keep itself from extinction. He understood none of this in the clearing. In the clearing, he only felt the scar and the cold had the specific quality of a hatred that had been there before he was born and had been waiting. He ran, or the sound he made ran him. It was not a decision, it was a direction, and he was in it. And then there was a centaur on the path before him, pale, blonde and enormous, already coming, already between Harry and the clearing. Firenze carried him out of the forest. He told Harry in the quiet way of someone translating something large into something sayable, that what he had seen was a thing that did dark magic at great cost. That a cursed half-life purchased with innocent blood was a thing only the most desperate would reach for. That the stars suggested, and the forest confirmed, and Firenze's himself believed, that what was in the forest tonight had once had a name that most people in this world would not say. Harry gripped the centaur's back and thought about a wand in a box on a shelf in Ollivander's, waiting. When he came out of the forest and found Hagrid and the others, he was carrying the vinewood wand in his right hand. He did not remember taking it out. It was steady in his grip the way it always was, which was a fact about unicorn hair cores and had nothing to do with comfort, and he held it anyway because it was what he had. Steady was not nothing. He had decided this months ago. It did not feel as true tonight as it had before he went in. Across the castle, in the dungeon stairwell that descended past the 3rd floor, into the part of the building that the students had been told not to enter, Quirrell moved in silence. He had the music. He had the preparation. He had the knowledge of everything that stood between the landing at the top and the mirror at the bottom, except the one thing the mirror would show him, which he was going to find out tonight. The timeline was a deadline. The deadline had arrived. Pah! They went through the trap door on a Thursday evening in June, after the other students had gone to dinner, and the 3rd floor corridor was quiet enough that the sound of Fluffy's breathing came through the door before Harry touched the handle. The decision had not been simple. There had been a conversation in the common room that morning, the kind that arrives with the weight of everything, the people having it know and are not saying, and at the end of it they had looked at each other across the low table and understood that understanding was not the same as being able to stop it. Quirrell was going for the stone tonight, or had already gone, and what was in the stone, what needed the stone, was something Harry had felt in the Forbidden Forest in May, with his scar burning and the cold settling into him like a second winter. He had explained this to Ron and Hermione with less certainty than he felt, and more certainty than he could justify. They had come anyway. He had not asked them to. Hagrid's information worked exactly as Hagrid had said it would. A harp, already playing in the chamber when they dropped through, keeping Fluffy asleep across all 3 enormous heads. The dog was vast in the way of things that exist at a scale that requires the mind to adjust before it can fully accept them. 3 heads, each larger than Harry's entire body, each breathing slowly, each eye closed. Harry moved past the heads the way you move past something that could end everything if it woke, which is to say, quickly and without looking directly at anything. The trapdoor was already open. They went through, one at a time, and fell into darkness that became, after a moment of weightless descent, a soft landing on something cool and green. And then the cool green thing tightened around Harry's arms. Devil's Snare. Hermione had prepared for this. She said it quickly, the name and the remedy in the same breath, and they relaxed. All 3 of them, because struggle only made it worse, and felt the plant loosen and release them into the chamber below. Harry dropped and landed and looked up through the gap where the plant trailed its roots, and they were in a stone chamber that smelled of earth and old magic, and there was a door ahead. The next chamber was full of sound, thousands of keys with wings, massing in the vaulted dark above like a living ceiling, each one catching the torchlight in a brief flash before the wings swept them away again. There was a locked door, and somewhere among all those wings was the key that fit it with its telltale mark, one wing bent and healed wrong, the scar of an old catch. Harry was on the broomstick before he had fully thought through the ascent, his body already knowing what his mind was catching up to, and he went up into the mass of wings, with his hand out and his eyes moving the way they moved above a Quidditch pitch, not looking for the thing but letting the thing show itself in the pattern of everything else. He caught it. The chessboard was enormous and waiting. Ron understood it before the rest of them did. He stood at the edge of the board and looked at the arrangement with the expression Harry had seen on his face over hundreds of games in the common room, the expression of someone who has been given a problem and is already several moves past it in their head. He said, "We take the pieces, places." He said, "I'll be the knight." He said it with the steadiness of someone who has decided something and sees no point in making it larger than it is. The game was real in the way that Hogwarts made many things real. The chess pieces were as tall as adults, and they moved with the particular intent of things that take their purpose seriously. Harry played his way across the board from the king's bishop's side, Ron directing the game with the focused authority of someone born to this, and the game progressed in that peculiar chess time that is not clock time, but pure logic working itself out. When Ron said he would have to be taken, Harry started forward, and Ron looked at him with the expression of someone who has done the calculation and would like to be allowed to live with the result, and Harry stopped. Ron was taken. He went down heavily, the chess piece completing its move with absolute mechanical finality, and he did not get up. Hermione took the first step toward him. Harry caught her arm. He looked at Ron, who was breathing. He could see that much from where he stood, and then at the board, which showed a clear path to the king. He won the game. 3 moves. He walked to where Ron lay and checked his face and his pulse with shaking hands, and Ron was unconscious and pale but breathing. And Harry stood up. Hermione was looking at him. "Go," she said. "I'll stay with him until someone comes. Go." The troll in the next chamber was already down, unconscious, collapsed against the far wall, having been addressed by someone earlier in the evening who had not needed to advertise the fact. Harry crossed the chamber without breaking stride. The potion room beyond had 7 bottles arranged in a line on a table, and purple fire behind him and black fire ahead, and Hermione's voice in his memory from 20 minutes ago, her instructions precise and unhurried because she had already worked through the puzzle and given him everything she could before she went back for Ron. He counted the bottles. He identified the shape of the smallest. He drank what she had told him to drink, and the black fire turned cold as he stepped through, and then he was on the other side of it. He was alone. The last chamber was lit by its own light, the source of which was not immediately apparent. It was large, larger than the chambers above it, which had each felt proportional to what they contained, and the light it held had a quality that made the room feel still in the way of something that has been preparing to be a particular kind of room for a long time. Quirrell was standing in front of the mirror. He was facing it with his back to the doorway, motionless, in the way of someone who has been standing in this position long enough to have become uncertain about how to move. The mirror stood against the far wall, its ornate gold frame absorbing the light, the surface filled with a reflection that Harry could not see from here. Quirrell had not heard Harry come in, or had heard him and was choosing not to acknowledge it yet. Either possibility had the same quality of wrongness. Quirrell's voice was entirely different. No stutter, no hesitation, none of the theatrical nervousness of the defense classroom. What replaced it was something clear and rather cold. He turned around. The turban was still on his head. His face was bare of pretense now, if not of anything else. There was no reading whatever was in his expression as anything except controlled attention. He looked at Harry with the stillness of someone who has already worked out the geometry of the room. "You're going to look into the mirror," Quirrell said, "and tell me what you see." "I'm not," Harry said. The decision to use the wand was Quirrell's, and it was immediate. He raised it with the speed of a man who had expected this response and had already committed his next action before Harry could reasonably react, and the spell that came from it was not anything Harry recognized from first-year defense classes. It hit the wall to Harry's left and left a mark in the stone that smelled of scorched air. Harry had moved right. The vinewood wand was in his hand. He sent back the only thing he had with certainty in the chaos of the moment, a shield, firm and solid, erected between himself and where Quirrell's wand was pointing, and it held, which was the wand doing exactly what Unicorn Haircores did, holding. But the force behind the next curse was enough to require him to step back, and the one after that pushed the shield until he could feel the effort in his arm. And after that he understood clearly and without argument what Quirrell's wand could do that his could not. It was not that his spells failed, they did not fail. The wand responded as it had always responded, consistently, steadily, each cast arriving where he aimed it and at the power he had behind it. But Quirrell's wand had the reach of something that drew from a deeper reserve, and every exchange cost Harry more than it cost his opponent, and there was no golden thread to bridge that difference, no twin-core recognition to lock the wands into the complication of equals. The thing that should have been his protection in this room was the thing he had left on a shelf in Ollivander's. He moved instead. The room was large, and large rooms had angles, and Quirrell was not chasing him. He was standing his ground, forcing Harry toward the mirror's side of the chamber, and Harry used the walls and the space between the spells at the fraction of a second that a curse needed to travel. And the mirror was behind him, and he understood what Quirrell wanted and was trying to prevent it and running out of room. A curse went wide. Harry went low, not planning, just moving, his body making the decision before his mind ratified it, and hit the floor on one knee and felt the spell pass over his head and looked up, and the mirror was in front of him. He was looking into the mirror. He saw himself, standing in the chamber, whole, holding the stone in his hand, a reddish-gold thing, small, more ordinary-looking than he had expected. In the reflection, the version of himself reached into its pocket. Harry's hand, here, now, not in the mirror, moved, something dropped into his pocket, small, dense, warm through the fabric in the way of something that had been enchanted to be found by exactly this kind of wanting, which was the wanting of someone who wanted to find it, and then put it somewhere it couldn't be used. He had a fraction of a second to register this. Quirrell's hand closed around his arm. The pain came from the contact point outward, his arm, Quirrell's fingers, the specific boundary of wherever skin met skin. And it was not the burning of a spell, but something more fundamental, as though the air itself had made a decision about what this touch was permitted to do, and the decision was final, and it was not Quirrell's decision. Quirrell made a sound that Harry had not heard before from a human throat, which was the sound of something being refused at a level below thought or intention. He grabbed Harry's other arm. The same thing happened. From the back of Quirrell's head, through the fabric of the turban, came a voice. "Let me see him turn. Let me see him." Quirrell turned. The turban unwound, or fell, or was discarded. Harry could not have said afterward which, only that what faced him now was two faces, one in front and one behind, the one behind chalk-white and terrible in the way that things are terrible when they have reduced themselves to the single point of a pure intention with no remainder. Red eyes, slit pupils, and a hatred so familiar in its shape that Harry recognized it the way you recognize something you've only ever seen second-hand, through the shape it carved in everything around it. He did not look away. Quirrell was burning at the palms. He was trying to reach Harry, and finding that every contact was the same. The air refused the touch. The magic in it refused. Something older than anything in this room refused, on behalf of a woman who had died in October 1981, a protection that did not require a wand, and did not require a choice, and did not require Harry to have done anything in Ollivander's or anywhere else. The white face was saying words. Harry heard them at some distance, the way you hear things when your body has begun to understand that it is shortly going to stop being conscious. Quirrell fell. What rose from him was not something Harry had a category for, not a ghost, not smoke, not any of the shapes that absence takes. It was something between a shape and a memory of a shape, white and thinning, passing through Harry as it went and carrying with it the full cold of what it was, winter and hatred and the long specific patience of something that had been waiting to come back. Then it was gone. Then Harry was on the floor. He could feel the stone in his pocket, hard and warm. He could feel his wand in his hand. He had held it through all of it, through the duel and the floor and the contact, and the end of it, held it the way you hold things when you have decided they are yours and you are not letting go. He looked at the ceiling of the chamber, which was stone and old, and did not require anything from him. He had used the wand as well as the wand could be used. He had asked it for what it had, and it had given what it had, and what it had not been enough to win what was happening here in any conventional sense of winning. That he was alive on this floor in this chamber had nothing to do with what wand he was holding. His scar had stopped burning. He closed his eyes. He was still holding the wand when everything else went dark. He woke to the particular quality of light that hospital windows produce, pale, even, medically non-committal about what time of day it was. His glasses were on the bedside table, and someone had folded them neatly beside a glass of water, which was the sort of detail that meant Madame Pomfrey had been involved. The ward was quiet. The sheets were clean. His right hand was wrapped in a bandage from wrist to knuckle, the skin beneath it still carrying some memory of heat that was not quite pain anymore, more like a reminder. His left hand was fine. His scar was not burning. He lay still for a while and thought about this, the scar not burning, which meant the thing that had always made it burn was not pressing against it from the other side. Whether this was because it was gone, or only because it had moved beyond the range at which it caused damage, he did not know. He suspected Dumbledore would have a view on this. He was right. Dumbledore arrived the following morning, or the morning after that. Harry lost count of the days in the way you lose count when you have been unconscious for a portion of them, carrying something in his hand that turned out, on closer inspection, to be 2 sherbet lemons in a small paper twist. He set the twist on the bedside table, offered one to Harry, and sat in the chair beside the bed with the particular settled quality of a man who has nowhere more important to be and intends to prove it by the way he sits. Harry took the sherbet lemon. He let it sit in his cheek for a moment, sour and sweet in equal measure. "Quirrell," Dumbledore said in the tone of someone beginning at the beginning, "is dead." Voldemort abandoned his host when it became untenable. The contact with you made it untenable. And I imagine you understand more clearly now than you did before why that should be. And the body could not survive what remained of him leaving it. Voldemort has dispersed again. He is not gone. That would be convenient, but inaccurate. He is as he was before this year, without a body and without enough of himself remaining to easily acquire one. This is a period of difficulty for him, and a period of careful watchfulness, shall we say, for the rest of us. Harry asked about the stone. Dumbledore said that the stone had been retrieved from Harry's pocket after he was found, and that it would be destroyed. Nicholas Flamel and Perenelle had been informed. They had lived for 665 years and a little, and they had enough stone remaining for what they needed, which was time to arrange the conclusion of a very long life. He said this with the care of someone who did not want to make death sound like a minor administrative matter, while also not wanting to make it sound worse than it was, and navigated the space between these two things with the practiced attention of a man who had been navigating it for a very long time himself. "And Ron?" Harry asked. "Recovering. He'll have a headache for some days. He is, however, very much himself, which I understand to mean that he has been telling everyone in proximity about the chess game." Harry was quiet for a moment. "Hermione's all right," Dumbledore added. "She was here when you were brought up. She has been conducting what I can only describe as very thorough visits." Harry looked at the ceiling and thought about the chessboard. Ron going down, the mechanical finality of it, he said, "Can I ask you something?" "You may ask me anything," Dumbledore said. "I reserve the right to give you the answer I am actually able to give, which may not be the answer you are hoping for, but you may certainly ask. If I had taken the Holy Wand," Harry said, "in Ollivander's, would it have been easier?" Last night, in the chamber, Dumbledore was quiet for long enough that Harry knew the answer before he heard it. "Yes," Dumbledore said. He did not say anything else for a moment, which Harry understood was him deciding how much to dress it up. He appeared to decide, not at all a wand that fit you more precisely would have given you more options in the chamber below. The precise margin is not something I can calculate, but I can tell you that the gap between your wand's capacity and what Voldemort's wand could do through Quirrell was real, and that it mattered at the level of what was available to you in the moments when you needed options. You survived the gap through improvisation and through a willingness to use your body and your surroundings when the magic alone was not sufficient. These are not small things, but they are not the same as having the advantage the Holy Wand would have given you." He paused. "You have earned a plainer answer than most students your age, and this is the plain one." Harry held the sherbet lemon between his teeth. "It didn't end up mattering, though," he said. "Did it? I mean, I found the stone Quirrell burned. I'm in the hospital wing, but I'm here." "The one didn't. It mattered," Dumbledore said. Gently but firmly, the way he said things he wanted to be heard. At every step before the end, the gap was real at every stage of the duel. The cost to you was real. He settled his hands in his lap. That it resolved as it did is your mother's doing, not mine and not your wand's. She chose to stand between you and death in 1981, and that choice left something in you that does not require a wand to function. It did not leave something that can function without courage or luck or good friends who go down at chess on your behalf. But the final protection, the thing that Quirrell could not overcome, that was Lily. Not Wandlaw, not destiny. Harry did not say anything for a moment. "I know," he said, finally, which was the truth. He had known it since he was on the floor of the chamber looking at the ceiling. He had just needed to hear Dumbledore say it plainly. He asked about Fawkes, whether the Phoenix had known when he gave those 2 feathers to Ollivander's keeping all those years ago, that it would come to this, a chamber underground, a boy with a wand that almost wasn't enough. The other feather in the hands of something that had been wearing a man's face. Dumbledore looked at his hands. "I have asked Fawkes this question myself," he said, "in so many words and in less direct approaches. Over the course of this year, I have not received an answer. Phoenixes sing when they choose to sing, and they are silent when they choose otherwise. And the silence has a quality that could mean many things, and I have found, after many decades of knowing Fawkes, that assigning meaning to the silence—" He looked up. "Which is to say, I don't know, and I am increasingly at peace with not knowing. I think you may get there faster than I did." Harry thought about Fawkes on his perch in the circular office, keeping his own counsel, watching things happen with the steady eyes of something that had been watching things happen for a very long time. "Maybe," he said, Ron arrived the next afternoon with the careful movements of someone who has been told by Madame Pomfrey to rest and has chosen to interpret this creatively. He was paler than usual, and there was a bruise along his jaw that he was managing to look rather proud of. And he sat in the chair Dumbledore had vacated and looked at Harry for a moment, and then said, "Madame Pomfrey wouldn't tell me if you were awake, so I came to check for myself." "I'm awake," Harry said. "Yeah," Ron said, "I can see that." He reached into his pocket and produced a large bar of Honeyduke's chocolate, slightly melted from being in his pocket, and put it on the bedside table. "She's fine. She just said she'd come later when you were less. She said when the ward was quieter, but I think she meant when you were less likely to be unconscious." Hermione arrived an hour later, carrying a book that was not, she mentioned. For Harry specifically, she simply happened to have it. She sat on the end of the bed and asked if he was in pain, and he said not really, and she nodded in the manner of someone checking an item off a list, and then they talked about the end-of-year exams, which were next week, Date, which Harry had somehow forgotten, and which prompted a 15-minute discussion of revision that Ron participated in, with the energy of someone who found the subject considerably less urgent than Hermione did. This was the most ordinary conversation Harry had ever had in a hospital bed, and it was, for that reason, exactly right. They stayed until Madame Pomfrey came to send them out, and left in the way of people who intend to come back soon, and the ward was quiet again, and Harry lay in the white institutional light and felt the very specific warmth of knowing that certain things were not going to change. He was discharged 2 days before the Hogwarts Express. The day before the train, he told no one where he was going. He went through the Leaky Cauldron in the late morning when it was populated only by a few quiet regulars, and Tom the barman, who looked at him with the expression of someone who recognizes a face and has decided not to say anything about it, and Harry walked through into Diagon Alley, which was warm and busy, and smelled of things he now associated with the beginning of this year rather than the beginning of his life in general, which was itself a change he had not expected. He walked to the end of the alley and pushed open the door of Ollivander's. The shop was exactly as it had been on the 31st of July, cool, dim, smelling of sawdust and something else. The columns of narrow boxes rising to the ceiling in the shadows. The single spindly chair stood in the center of the floor. The door closed behind him. "Mr. Potter," said Ollivander from somewhere among the shelves. Then he was at the counter, in the way he was always at the counter, appearing without having visibly arrived, his pale, moon-colored eyes already doing what they had always done, which was to look at Harry and read something. "You look well." "I am," Harry said, "mostly." Ollivander looked at his bandaged hand. He said nothing about it. Raw. He reached below the counter, moved something with the decisive care of someone who knows exactly where everything is, and set a long, narrow box on the wood between them. He did not open it. The box was unlacquered wood. Harry knew the wand inside it without needing to see it. Holly, 11 inches, phoenix feather, nice and supple. 7 galleons that he had never paid, a wand that had been here since the 31st of July and had waited, as Ollivander had said it would, because it had chosen once, and wands that have chosen do not unchoose. He stood and looked at the closed box. He thought about the chamber. The duel he could not fully win. The floor of it, and his wand still in his hand, and surviving on something that had nothing to do with what he was holding. He thought about what Dumbledore had said, that the gap was real, that it mattered at every step before the end, and he knew that was true, and stood with knowing it. He thought about the fire in Ollivander's last July, the golden sparks, the first breath after holding your breath for 11 years. He thought about vine wood and unicorn hair, and adequate and not perfect, Ollivander was quiet. He looked at Harry over the box between them with the pale, unnerving eyes that had never asked anyone to find him easy to be in a room with. He nodded once, the way someone nods, when they have received a complete answer in something that might sound like an incomplete sentence. He took the box back. He set it somewhere below the counter with a deliberate care of something being returned to a known place. Harry paid for nothing. He had bought nothing. He left. The Hogwarts Express South ran through fields that were entirely and specifically ordinary, green and quiet, intersected at intervals by roads and small stations and the backs of houses where nothing remarkable was happening. Harry watched them through the window and let them be ordinary. Ron was asleep against the far window. He had fallen asleep approximately 12 minutes after the train left the station, his head at an angle that would produce a stiff neck and which he would not acknowledge when he woke. Hermione was reading. She had been reading since King's Cross and was most of the way through something thick and annotated, and the turn of a page every few minutes was the only sound in the compartment besides the rhythm of the train. Harry's wand was in his pocket. It was steady there, the way it was always steady, the way it had been steady in defense class and in the bathroom with the troll, and in the chamber underground when being steady had been exactly enough and also not quite enough, both at the same time. And he had lived with that, and he would live with it, and he was choosing to live with it. He thought about next summer. Whether he would go back to Ollivander's then, what the holly wand would feel like when, if he lifted it from its box and held it, after a year of not holding it. Whether it would still feel the way it had felt in that first moment, the sparks, the rightness, the breath. He thought, probably exactly as right as it always would have, he thought, probably next summer. The train passed through a long curve, and the fields opened into something wider, and England went by outside the window, in the way that England does, which is without particular ceremony and without asking to